Yes, so do you think that there is something specific to the art form of painting that makes it able to communicate meaning?
Yes, I do. I think that from my point of view, painting is a sort of freestanding art. There are other kinds of art, like conceptual art or sculpture or whatever, but I think painting is something special because it's the only art form where you have complete control of colour. Hopefully total control of colour, and this, I think, ultimately is what decides. Baudelaire thought anyway, as he said, I read a lot of Baudelaire now because I think he's probably the best art critic that ever wrote, particularly about colour. And he said something like, if I get the translation right, that painting is good when every tone gives value to another. And so there's this very special quality of really good painting where the colour itself seems to be doing the work of communicating, if we want to use that word. I mean, I don't think of painting as communicating, but so much as perhaps transmitting the communication. To me sounds a little bit too much like the advertising business, and it means you have something to say. And I agree with Ad Reinhardt, who wrote once, one of his aphorisms was, what on earth do we mean when we say the artist has something to say? I have opinions about things and I can tell people my ideas, but I wouldn't do that in painting. So what is communicated in painting is something quite different. I think it's something very, very special and different, and it's a kind of truth, a kind of revelation, and something that is gives you a sort of combination of surprise and joy when you see it. And again, coming back to Baudelaire, he said something like, the poetry of a painting is something that arises out of the act of making without the artist being aware of it. So if you're not aware of it, then you're not trying to communicate something. It's more a discovery which comes out of the act of making and the system of making, if you like.
The artist has to be aware of what he wants to communicate. Or no, you don't.
I don't think so. No, I don't know what I'm going. I have no
so
idea.
Does the person looking at the painting have to want to get something out of it, or standing in front of a painting, should the painting communicate or transmit something directly?
Transmission of feeling is good. I think that again, another writer on art that I admire greatly, again the French, is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who thought that the feeling that you get from art is total, is somatic, is the whole body, not just the mind. So it's not the communication of an idea, although some paintings communicate ideas. But I think if you took, supposing that we look at a painting, say 300 years old, and it had some kind of message that was very important at that time, but that message is no longer important to us. Surely the painting is not worthless just because the message is no longer important or relevant, because the painting has its own meaning and its own truth.
So painting can be, would you argue that painting is a painted object, a painting, is a self-sufficient thing?
Personally, yes. I mean, that's why I love abstract painting. It's not that I don't like any figurative painting, of course I do. And all painting, of course, is figurative. So, and I love painting. But I think that the advent of abstract art, something completely new happened. This amazing freedom. And in particular, I think was the revelation that came across the Atlantic from New York when we saw our first experience of paintings by Rothko and Barnett Newman. Something completely new happened. Of course, it had happened much earlier because Casimir Margevich had done it, and so had Mondrian. So, I mean, it started, I suppose, about 100 years ago, and now I feel that abstract art really, or called non-figurative art, or whatever you want to call it, is a kind of established fact. And it is, coming back to your previous question, it is a totally freestanding art form, and quite separate from other things like conceptual art of various kinds, or even sculpture, or film. Although I do think that non-figurative painting has formal things in common, and perhaps feelings in common with other things, in particular music.
But is there something about the medium of paint that communicates that?
Well, I think it's very important that it's physical. I mean, I think that, we've just had this wonderful exhibition, Matisse's cutouts, and the medium is cut paper, although it's got paint on it, but the medium is cut paper. And I would consider those paintings. I mean, I think they're paintings, but they're actually collages of cut paper. So I don't think it has to be paint. I think it probably needs to be flat. I think it doesn't move. It needs to be flat, and above all, it must be an art of relationships. I think that's the most important thing. And a lot of conceptual art isn't an art of relationships, or if there are relationships, they're not that important. But I think the relationships of colour, however the colour of whatever form the colour takes, whether it's cut paper or paint or ink or even the latest photographic digital material. I mean, that's quite interesting because I do quite a lot of photography, and I have a machine which prints using pigment inks, and I print on rag paper, and I have complete control of what colour gets printed, total control, because now with the computer applications that we have, you do have complete control of colour. So I sort of wonder if it's not painting, it's very close to painting. But of course, I'm not really interested in abstract photography, so in that sense, it's very separate from what I do as a painter.
So, but abstract photography can have relationships of colour and tone.
Indeed, yes. I'm not saying I would never do it, it doesn't interest me much at the moment. Although, because we've got the new applications like Photoshop, where you have such control of colour, and the printers now are so good, so sophisticated, that one has total control of colour, so perhaps abstract photography is perhaps a possibility again. I think it went very stale, and I used to think that I wasn't very interested in formal aspects of photography, whereas formal aspects of form in painting for me is everything. The precise relationships are everything, because that's what makes the feeling. But in photography, I don't think it is that makes the feeling. I'm not sure what it is in photography. So photography is some way distanced from painting. That's what I mean by painting being freestanding. You see it sort of bleeds off into photography and other things. But in the end, I think it's A, abstract, and B, about relationships. So it's very, very formal. But the formal transmits, in my opinion, a very good painting. The formal transmits very intense feelings.
But surely a photograph can do that as well.
I think a photograph can do it. That's why.
So there's not. So
there is a relationship.
Although
it's different from a painting is different from a photograph. But from what you've just said, in terms of communicating meaning, actually, if it's relationship of form and colour, and a photograph has got both of those, then a photograph can communicate in the same way as a painting.
That's true, but although you have complete control of the colour, you don't have really complete control of what's in front of the lens. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of chance in photography as well. You can't control everything. But since my painting also involves chance operations, I guess that's why I like photography nearly as much as I like painting. Because I think they're very, very close.
You have talked about how much you enjoy reading Baudelaire. Can you say something about Baudelaire's thoughts on colour and why they resonate to you so much?
Yes, I think he was really, I suppose, about 100 years ahead of his time, really, because when Baudelaire, as a poet, is not talking as a literary man, he's speaking almost as if he's a painter himself, and he understands colour. And of course he, at the time when he wrote the essay, which I like very much, it's called On Colour. It's an essay contained in the chapter of, in the book of his art criticism, there's a chapter on the Salon of 1846. And it's there that he wrote this essay on colour. And really it's a prelude to writing about the work of Eugène Delacroix. And I mentioned before but the importance of every tone, by which he means every colour, in a painting having an effect on every other one. This is something that I suppose Delacroix brought into painting, and it's interesting that in this essay Baudelaire separates those painters who are great draftsmen and those who are great colourists, and a bit like Berenson separating the Florentines from the Venetians. There he saw. For him, it was painting which organised colour in a particular way, which was the sort of painting that transmitted the feelings of what he called the poetry of the painting, comes through the very precise and special colour relationships which I like the voice of that particular artist. And so although you could, in theory, make a painting that looked a bit like a Delacroix or a Géricault, you could always try a pastiche, but it would be incredibly difficult to make an original one, because the way the colour is modulated is like that particular artist's voice. And although it comes partly from what you see, it probably comes more from inside than observance of colour. And of course later on, when colour became central in French 19th century painting, it does come more from nature, from what you see. But it seemed to me that in the case of Delacroix, he was able to do both. There was the colour from the imagination and colour seen, made into a single idea of colour, which is specifically his. And I think that Baudelaire saw this, where probably nobody else of his time could have seen that. Now I think many painters can understand that. It's the most, certainly in French painting, from Impressionism through Cézanne and Matisse. That's how it works. And Matisse's colour comes both from seeing and from imagination. In fact, I think they become one and the same thing in some strange way. And I think when I paint, the colours that appear in my paintings come from a system of how I want colours to be related to each other. It's sort of law governed, you know, where what's light, what's dark, what's in the group of blues, what's in the group of yellows, and so on, all adding up to a way of modulating colour, which is, coming back to Baudelaire, that thing that arises out of the working of painting, the material work of getting colours mixed up and relating them to each other. That work is what produces the feeling of the painting.
Although I know you wouldn't describe yourself as a musician, you have been involved a lot in the past with experimental music. You've played with the Portsmouth Symphonia, with the Liverpool Band Deaf School. What for you is the connection between painting and music?
Well, I've always loved music, but I didn't know, when I was young, I didn't know very much about modern music, and I only knew the work mainly of Stockhausen and a little bit of Xenakis. And what really appealed to me about particularly the English school of composers, with whom I began to associate and work around 1968, was experimental method, and the element of surprise that, as in the paintings I was making then, and I'm still making really, setting up conditions where something very unusual might happen, this coming together of sounds or colours in such a way that something was discovered, something completely new, sometimes called emergent characteristic. To explain exactly what an emergent characteristic really is, it's like, we know what salt is like. We know salt's made from two noxious substances, sodium and chlorine, both of which are extremely unpleasant substances. There's nothing in the quality of either of those substances that could ever lead you to think that we become something pleasant and edible like table salt. It's what happens with the experimental music, and I suppose with all great music, but particularly with the modern kind of experimental music, which is based on Cage, really. John Cage was the central figure of experimental music, who dominated really in the 60s the English experimental school. The use of chance, really, and the surprise that comes from setting up conditions where something can happen. Now, this takes a certain amount of skill and experience, and just as one is dealing with material things in the art of painting, so in music you are dealing with something very material, very concrete, if you like. And the word concrete was used a lot about art, all sorts of art at that time, concrete poetry, concrete music, concrete art, all of these things. The material was very, very important, and a principle of organising material which would possibly lead to something very new and surprising. And one of the things which happened in the 60s was the formation of the Scratch Orchestra by Cornelius Cardew, Michael Parsons and Howard Skempton, the three major English composers of the period. And the Scratch Orchestra fascinated me because it seemed that there were a large number of people who were making music in precisely this way of putting together a set of principles, putting them in action, and then producing a music. And that to me is very like the way that I was making paintings, and still do. Except then, of course, I was part of a group called the Systems Group, which used very strict, or so we thought, very strict mathematical principles or principles of logic, a kind of analytic approach to making art. But the way I make art now is the same thing really, but it's just that I use a fluid approach. So all the materials that I use are very fluid. I use the gesture and the flow of ink or paint or whatever it is, allowing things to flow and to use gravity and all of these things. Yes, I found that the experimental method in music and the experimental method in painting seemed to come together at that time, in the late 60s, early 70s, and started to produce quite surprising new things. Although it's still music and painting, which are sort of ancient art forms, but they seem to produce something very surprising and almost a different kind of emotion, to what we were used to. There was very little sweetness in that music. Later on, more mellifluous sounds started to came back in, especially with what was called minimal music. But in the late 60s, it was, there's a particular piece by Cardew, paragraph 7 of a piece called The Great Learning, where the text is sung by as many singers as you can muster, each one singing the text, so one line of the text, with a single tone, which the singer has heard from another part of the group of singers. There could be as many as 50, even 100 singers. And so when you come to the next line of text, you draw breath and you sing that text with a single note. But you've picked up that note from something you've heard somewhere else. And gradually, something happens. The first time I performed in this, when we finished, everybody looked at each other and in complete silence and did we do that? Because it was something so strange and so new. Nobody had ever thought of doing this before. But of course it took this really quite elementary rule by Cardew, set by Cardew the composer, sing this note for the length of one breath. And of course some people were professional singers, others could hardly sing a note, and so the length of breath was different in every single case. So all of this was sort of drifting apart and then coming together, changing, strange, developing harmony, which I'd never heard anything like it before or since.
David, you've been politically involved in the past and still feel passionately about many of the events unfolding in the world today. Do you consider that by making paintings you are taking a moral or ethical stance?
Yeah, this is a question which torments me endlessly. I do think that that non-figurative painting, in some rather contradictory way, doesn't comment on the actualities of war and peace and all the awful things that are happening in the world. I couldn't possibly make a painting about that, and I do admire people who can, namely in particular the great cartoonists who can comment very strongly and move one emotionally. I admire them, but I can't possibly do it. I mean, I have, I did when I was quite a bit younger, go on the street over all sorts of issues and got very involved with the issues which I considered important at the time, and still consider important, but I could never have made a painting about them. Perhaps I just don't have that kind of talent. So there was a slogan in those years that was going about, which was politicise the art is not the art. And I suppose that's what I am. I don't do political art, but I'm a politicised artist. Now the question is then, could the non-figurative art ever in any way say anything about the actualities? And a painter I admire greatly in that respect would be Robert Motherwell, and because he made paintings with political titles, like the Elegies for the Spanish Republic. And for me they work, but they're totally non-representational, but they seem to work. And they work without putting text in. I mean, one of my ways of making a painting more political is to actually write on it. And so the writing becomes both a formal device in the painting and also something which inflects the painting, rather in the way that music, film music, can inflect the mood of film. But I don't do it very often. But I'm not averse to putting text in the painting in order to push it in that direction towards a certain feeling about a certain thing. I made a painting that just has one word on it, which is Shatila, which was many years ago now, a terrible massacre of Palestinians in Lebanon, where I think 900 men, women and children were massacred. And there were two of these camps, Shabra and Shatila. And I just used a single word, Shatila, in the painting. And I think, well, it seems to work because I get responses to that painting. I don't do this very often, and maybe that's not really the function of painting at all. I'm more and more thinking that maybe painting really, if the painting's really good, it does have perhaps a kind of healing function. It may be therapeutic, I just don't know. I do know when the emotion is very strong, when the painting, as it were, talks back to me, I know it's a good one. And you know, coming back to the Baudelaire thing, you know, the poetry, if you like, the message, the poetry, whatever it is, about the painting, comes through the act of making, the material act of organising the stuff of painting into a coherent form. And I suppose that I will never know the answer to this question as to whether there is could be that kind of specific meaning in an abstract painting. I would like to think that there could be, but it may not be the case.
But that meaning is connected to the form of the making of the painting. It's not a meaning in a political sense. It's
well, I think that, you know...
because I mean, if we talk about that Motherwell painting that you mentioned, you say that painting works, so it works in a formal way. Does it communicate to you something of the horrors of the Spanish Civil War? Or just, are you just taking the title and saying, oh, this is what it's about?
paintings by Motherwell. I don't know how many there are, but I've seen one or two, and they're black and white, so there's no colour in them at all, just the colours black and white. And generally the type of form is two or more vertical bars of black, sandwiching two ovoid black forms or more. And some are called Elegy to the Spanish Republic, another one is Pancho Villa, Dead or Alive. And this is I don't know how many of these paintings there are, as I say, I think there may be several of this type. And it may be just that particular relationship between the black bars and masses and white ground, which somehow fits well with the title. If you took the title away, if I didn't know they were called, you took the title away, they would still have this feeling of, I suppose, tragic, really. Yeah, tragic. The thing about Picasso's Guernica is tragic. It is both very, very formal, one of his best paintings, a lot of people think, and it's very formal, beautifully constructed, and for me it's definitely tragic. Now, later paintings of Picasso about anti-war paintings, like the Korean massacres and War and Peace, I don't think they're very good paintings. I think they're Picasso's worst paintings. To me, they're rather incoherent. And but the last thing you'd say about Guernica is it's incoherent. It's formally marvellous work. And I think that it's that. I think the tragedy of the painting, I mean, I suppose everybody knows the story of the bombing of this city by the Luftwaffe, and the anger that it caused in Picasso. But it is a mystery where the feeling of tragedy, if you think that it's there, and I really believe that there's a feeling of tragedy there. How did it get there? You know, precisely what is it about the construction of that painting made in the 30s and later paintings made in the 50s? Why is it that the paintings made in the 50s don't seem to work for me when that particular painting of the bombed Spanish city during the Civil War, why does that work so well? And again, I think it's a formal question. So the depth of the feeling and the beauty of the form seem to go together.
So what, in your opinion, David, is abstract painting?
When I had my studio in the East End of London, I used to walk along the canal banks, and along this almost like a sort of alternative universe, because there's no traffic on canals, but you can hear the traffic, and but you're sort of underneath the bridges, and you're walking. As the pace of things is different, and so different things seem to be happening. So you're more aware of unusual events. So for me, now I'm living in the mountains. I find I'm living in a sort of four-dimensional space where there's not only up and down and that way and that way, but there's also the time of things changing constantly. Everything is changing. And I find that in the metropolis, things are more or less, I know things happen, but things, it seems to be the same thing happening over and over again, so it's very sort of regular. Whereas what I find when I walk here is events, surprising and unusual events. And what is happening is sort of changing me. So really this abstract painting, I have to say, is probably about my state of being rather than anything else. I think that perhaps it always has been, even the systems were probably about that, because it was about change, how things change. And during this process of change, these sometimes very unusual, surprising things happen. delightful things sometimes, and things that make you feel very glad. You feel very glad just because you found them. There's almost no other reason. It's just that you've come across this, and there's something very revealing and powerful and gladdening and strange. And painting in the studio is, for me, recreating that state, really, I suppose. But it's very artificial in the studio, because then I've got rules of how to use materials and what to use, how to use it, and sets of, if you like, systems and rules in order to get on and make something. But all those things relate to something that's happened while I've been walking.